just passed the 6-month deadline for the interim deal. The Joint Plan of Action concluded in Geneva last November, and just before the deadline, agreement was reached on a 4-month extension. So I want to speak a little bit about the extension and about prospects for a comprehensive deal. I was involved in these negotiations from 2009 to 2013. It was a very sterile period of negotiations. Not much was accomplished. And I had the clear impression at the time that the Iranian delegation wasn't terribly committed to reaching a negotiated conclusion. I think after the election of Hassan Rouhani in June of 2013, that has changed. And my sense is now, and I hear this from my former American colleagues in the negotiations, that both sides, and when I talk about both sides, I'm talking about the so-called E3+3 and the Iran on opposite sides. Both sides are genuinely committed to try to achieve a solution. And I believe both sides attempted very, very hard to achieve a comprehensive solution by the end of this 6-month period, which was July 20th. The P5+1 wanted to finish by July 20th because they were eager to turn the 6-month freeze on Iran's nuclear program into a significant reduction. From the U.S. side, the U.S. knew that Congress would be breathing down the neck of the U.S. administration, and if there was no deal by July 20th, would be pressing for draconian additional economic sanctions, which would have a disruptive effect on further negotiations. And so they were incentivized to finish by July 20th. Also, the Americans were conscious of our electoral calendar. We have midterm elections in November. And if you could finish the negotiations by July 20th, you could get this out of the way and not make it an issue in our election. So plenty of incentives on the American side. For Iran, there were incentives also to finish by July 20th. The Iranians were very disappointed by the sanctions relief they gained during the 6-month deal. Critics of the interim deal, especially the Israelis, predicted that in this period, the sanctions regime would simply unravel. That didn't happen, didn't materialize. Governments and companies all over the world were very cautious about dealing with Iran during this interim period. They wanted to wait until there was a comprehensive agreement and sanctions were actually lifted before cutting new deals with Iran. The Iranians recognized this. The Iranian public recognized this. And they felt the only way they're going to get sanctions really lifted was to strike a comprehensive deal, so they were incentivized to do this by July 20th. So both sides worked very hard, especially in this most recent round between July 2nd and July 20th to finalize a comprehensive deal. They made some significant progress on a difficult issue of a heavy water reactor at a place called Arak. They made some progress. This was a reactor that I believe the Iranians built in order to produce plutonium for nuclear weapons. A critical objective of the E3+3 was to shut it down or modify it in a way as to reduce its potential production of plutonium. They seem to be on the way to a compromise on that issue. Similarly, the Fordo enrichment plant. This was a covert enrichment facility buried deep underground, less vulnerable to military attack than the other big enrichment facility. The E3+3 wanted to be closed down. Iran wanted to continue operating it. They seemed to be working out some kind of a compromise that would involve altering the purpose from a significant scale enrichment facility to something else, perhaps a facility for research and development. But despite genuine efforts to break through, and despite this evidence of progress, they weren't able to break through, excuse me, on the most critical issue of the negotiation, and that's the uranium enrichment capacity that Iran would be allowed to possess under an agreement. Now, Iran was insisting on having sufficient enrichment capacity to provide enriched fuel for the Russian-supplied nuclear power reactor at a place called Bushehr. And it wanted to have that enrichment capacity by the year 2021. There was a Russian-Iran agreement that Russia would supply fuel for that power reactor for about 10 years. But this fuel supply contract would run out in 2021, and the Iranians were saying, we have to have the capability to do it ourselves when this contract ran out. So in July 7th, the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, said in a speech that Iran had to have very large enrichment capacity. He said 190,000 separative work units, which is a technical term describing enrichment capacity. But what this means would be a huge expansion of Iran's current enrichment capability. Roughly, it's 190,000 separative work units is equivalent to well over 100,000 centrifuges. Now, Iran has about 19,000 installed centrifuges, only 10,000 of which are actually operating. So what the Supreme Leader was talking about was over a tenfold expansion in existing operating capability. And then the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran said the following day, on July 8th, that they would need to have this capability in place within 8 years. And during this 8 years, they'd have to do research and development on very advanced centrifuges. They have to test these out. They'd have to mass produce them so that after 8 years, they would have in place the capability to provide fuel for this nuclear power reactor. Now, the problem, a big problem with having such a large enrichment capacity is that it would give Iran the option, if it so decided, suddenly to break out of an agreement and to produce enough fuel, enough weapons-grade fuel for a single nuclear bomb in a matter of weeks. And so this was clearly unacceptable to the E3+3 governments. And at the same time, the Iranians were saying, and Foreign Minister Javad Zarif said publicly, that during this agreement, Iran would not agree to reduce its current uranium enrichment capacity. Now, the E3+3, the P5+1, they're interchangeable terms, had a very different view of this critical issue of enrichment capacity. For the E3+3, a key goal on this issue was to lengthen the period of time that it would take Iran to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a single bomb. Now it's about 2 to 3 months. With the capacity the Supreme Leader talked about, it could be a couple of weeks. but the E3+3 wanted to lengthen this capacity to 6 months, 12 months, or even more, to give the international community plenty of time to react in case they saw Iran breaking out of its constraints. And to lengthen this breakout timeline, they needed to reduce very significantly the enrichment capacity of Iran from current levels. So they were talking about, at most, an enrichment capacity limited to a couple of thousand centrifuges of the current first generation. But they thought that this should be acceptable to the Iranians because when you look at Iran's near-term needs for enriched uranium, they see that the only near-term needs are to provide fuel for a couple of small research reactors. Reactors that can produce medical isotopes for the diagnosis and treatment of cancer. The Iranians have a research reactor actually provided by the United States many, many years ago. It's this Arak reactor I talked about will probably be converted to use enriched uranium, so it has a need to have enriched uranium for that. It also wants to build a small second research reactor as well. But all of these needs could be met at very low levels of centrifuges. And the U.S. and its partners were saying this should be enough. You should be able to meet your near-term needs with this limited capacity. As far as your need to fuel this power reactors take about 100 times more enriched uranium than research reactors. But to meet your need to fuel this Russian-supplied reactor at Bushehr, the Russians are happy to extend its 10-year fuel supply contract for the life of the reactor. That's the sensible thing for you to do. It's cheaper. The Russians know how to design fuel for the reactor they built. The Iranians don't have the intellectual property rights to produce their own fuel. And so it makes all the sense in the world to produce fuel for these small research reactors, rely on the Russians and the international market to provide fuel for power reactors. And the E3+3 countries said, the Iranians said, no, we can't do that. We can't rely on the international market. We can't even rely on the Russians because we were burned in the past. In the 70s, there was a European enriched uranium consortium, EuroDIF. The Iranians got burned. The EuroDIF consortium didn't meet their obligations to Iran. Iran says we can't afford to do this again. We can't even rely on the Russians, who've been pretty good partners on the Bushehr project. We need to have our own fuel independently, so we can't be subject to a supply cutoff. Well, the E3+3 said, well, if you're concerned about a supply disruption, then you should buy from the Russians a 5-year supply of reactor fuel. Store it on Iranian territory. You don't have to be worried about a supply disruption. But that wasn't good enough. Anyway, the E3+3 countries are concerned. Why is it that Iran is insisting on an enrichment capacity that would be difficult technically for them to produce, of questionable legality because of the intellectual property right issues, not economical at all? The Russians could do this much more cheaply. Why are they going to all this expense and effort and so forth to do this on their own? And that raises questions about Iran's ultimate intentions. Why did they need this excess capacity? Is it so that they could have a very short breakout time? Anyway, that's the kind of conclusion that many in the international community will draw about Iran's desire for this very large enrichment capacity. Anyway, this is I haven't gone through all of the issues in the negotiations, but this is the hard issue. This is the pacing issue, I think, in whether there's going to be an agreement. Well, they couldn't break through in time for July 20th. They agreed to this 4-month extension to November 24th. And that's the 1-year anniversary of the conclusion of the interim deal. During the 4-month period, the E3+3 agreed to release $2.8 billion worth of Iran's oil revenues that have been held up in restricted overseas banking accounts. And the Iranians agreed that in exchange for that $2.8 billion, they were going to make certain concessions, the most significant of which was to take some of the near 20% enriched fuel that's already been turned into powdered form. They would turn it into metallic fuel plates. Once it's in fuel plates for reactors, it's very, very difficult and time-consuming to turn it back into the gaseous form that could be used to enrich to weapons levels. So that's where we are. 4 months now to try to reach this deal. But even with the 4 additional months of extra time, it's going to be a huge challenge. One reason it's going to be a huge challenge is that on both sides, there are very strong domestic critics. The U.S. Congress, there are many members of the U.S. Congress who are opposed to any deal and want the U.S. administration to drive a very hard bargain. In coming weeks, I'm sure the administration will have to fight off efforts by U.S. Congress to pass new sanctions legislation that would impose additional draconian sanctions on Iran. The members of Congress say this is necessary to give the Iranians incentive to negotiate seriously. The administration believes this would have a disruptive effect on the talks. But President Rouhani also faces strong domestic opposition. This is something Dina and Ali understand better than I do, and undoubtedly will speak to it. But there are Iranian hardliners who oppose any engagement with the West, with the great Satan. They oppose a deal. And their concern is that if Rouhani's administration strikes a deal and it results in the lifting of sanctions and the improvement of the Iranian economy, that this will give a great boost in Iran to reform and moderate forces in Iran. So from an Iranian perspective, this is really about the future of Iran and governance in Iran. You know, one factor that could provide additional incentive to conclude a deal is the belief that a nuclear deal could facilitate U.S. or Western Iranian cooperation on regional security issues, on Syria, on Iraq, on Afghanistan. There are many who believe, including me, that Iran and the U.S. do have common interests in these areas, a convergence of interests, and that working together could help solve these problems. But at the same time, there are strong opponents, both in the U.S. and in Iran, are working together on regional issues. And this very strong opposition, I think, has led to caution on the part of both Washington and Tehran in trying to work together on these regional issues. And both Washington and Tehran, both the U.S. and Iranian delegations take the view we have to conclude a nuclear deal on its merits. Neither side is prepared to make concessions on nuclear issues in order to get greater cooperation on the regional issues. So, President Obama said several months ago that he thought the chances of an agreement are about 50-50. I'd say that's about right. I maybe place it a little higher than that, but I think it's a very iffy proposition. There's strong forces at work in both countries. They're going to oppose a deal and make it very difficult to give the negotiators the room for maneuver they need to finalize a deal.